Welcome, everyone. We're diving deep into supermoons today. And wow, you guys have given us a lot to work with. We've got NASA reports, cultural perspectives, personal stories, even some myths debunked. It's going to be fascinating to unpack it all.
Oh, definitely. It seems like everyone's got an opinion on supermoons, but, sorting out the science from the folklore, that can be a challenge sometimes.
So let's start with that science then. When we say supermoon, what does that actually mean, like astronomically speaking?
Well, supermoon itself, it's actually more of a popular term than an official scientific one.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it's become pretty common because it describes something people find visually interesting. Basically, a supermoon happens when you have a full moon, and it's also at the point in its orbit where it's closest to Earth.
Okay, so the moon's orbit, it's not a perfect circle, right,
Exactly.
Claire?
It's elliptical,
Yeah.
kind of more oval shaped. So there's a point where it's closest to Earth. We call that perigee. And then the farthest point is apogee. When a full moon happens at or near perigee, boom,
Wow.
supermoon.
And that's what makes it look bigger and brighter. I know we've got sources mentioning 14% bigger, 30% brighter. But is that something you actually notice just looking at it?
That's a good question. Those numbers do sound dramatic. And the NASA images, if you compare a supermoon to a regular full moon side by side, there is a visible difference. But if you're just casually looking up at the sky, it's more subtle.
Oh, okay.
Unless you're really paying close attention to the moon every night, you might not even realize. Plus, things like the atmosphere, how clear the sky is, that can affect how bright it appears, too.
So it's not like suddenly, bam, giant moon in the sky.
Right. It's more like, oh, hey, the full moon looks a little extra nice tonight. The media does tend to hype up the visual aspect, but the really cool part is understanding why it happens, those orbital mechanics.
Speaking of hype, we've got to address some of these supermoon myths. Werewolves, crime rates, even babies being born more often. Where do we even start with this?
Well, I think a systematic approach helps. We can look at each claim and see what the science actually says. That whole full moon madness idea, like the moon makes people crazy, more accidents, more crime, that's been studied a lot, and it's been debunked.
So no need to board up the windows when the next supermoon comes around.
Haha, exactly. A lot of these beliefs come from mixing up correlation and causation. Just because two things happen around the same time doesn't mean one causes the other. There was a study that looked at crime rates over several years, and they found no link to the full moon supermoon or not.
That makes sense. What about some of the personal stories? We had some people swear their sleep gets messed up during a full moon. Any truth to that?
That one's a little more tricky. The moon's not casting some sleep-stealing spell or anything, but there is some research that hints at a connection between lunar cycles and how we sleep. One study looked at kids. They found that around the full moon, kids got a bit less sleep on average, probably because the extra light messes with melatonin production.
Interesting. So it's more about the light itself than some mystical moon power.
That seems to be the case. And it's not just kids either. Back in 2013, a study in Current Biology looked at adults. They found that even if you block out all moonlight around the full moon, people had lower melatonin, took longer to fall asleep, and got less REM sleep. It suggests maybe deep down we've still got some internal clock that's linked to the moon's phases.
Wow, even with all our artificial light nowadays. So even though we can rule out the werewolves and crime sprees, maybe our bodies are still tuned in to the moon a little bit.
It seems that way. But it's important to remember, these studies are still pretty early. We need more research to really understand the full picture of how the moon and human biology interact. And there's the psychological side too. Our beliefs and expectations can really color our experiences.
Like that illusory correlation thing. Our brains like to connect the dots, even when there's no real link.
Exactly. That Cleveland Clinic article explained it well. If you believe the full moon affects your sleep, you're more likely to notice and remember any sleep issues, even if they happen just as often at other times.
So healthy skepticism is always a good thing when we're looking at these claims.
Oh, absolutely. But skepticism shouldn't stop us from exploring all the fascinating possibilities, the connection between humans and the moon. It's got so much history, mythology, and scientific intrigue woven into it. That's what makes a deep dive like this so exciting. While we're on the topic of the moon's influence, we can't forget about tides. That's one area where the moon's pull is undeniable.
Absolutely. And since the supermoon means the moon is closer, does that make those tides even more extreme?
It definitely does. A supermoon's gravity, it's stronger. So you get those extra high and low tides. Sometimes they're called king tides.
I've heard that term. And some of our sources mention coastal flooding as a possible concern with supermoons. Is that a legitimate risk or is that overblown?
Well, a single supermoon, It's not going to cause widespread flooding on its own, but it can make things worse in areas that are already vulnerable.
Ah, I see. So if you've got a coastline that's prone to flooding, and then a supermoon happens to line up with a storm surge or heavy rain, that's when you could have problems.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that the moon, it's not just some pretty light in the sky. It has a real physical impact on our planet. And sometimes that impact can be, well, let's say, not so pretty.
Okay, we've covered a lot of the science behind supermoons, but we've also got some interesting material about the cultural and spiritual side of things. Different cultures all over the world, they've got their own takes on supermoons.
Oh, absolutely. The science tells us how supermoons happen, but cultures have been asking why for centuries. They've woven supermoons into their beliefs, their stories, their rituals. It's quite fascinating.
Like we have this source talking about Native American tribes. They see the supermoon as a time for spiritual reflection, connection to nature. They hold ceremonies, give thanks, seek guidance. It's really beautiful.
It really is. There's a deep reverence for the natural world in many Native American traditions. The moon is seen as this powerful force, influencing not just the tides, but the cycles of life, growth, renewal.
And what about in Eastern traditions? We've got a source that mentions the Buddhist perspective.
In Buddhism, the supermoon, like the full moon in general, it's often linked to enlightenment, spiritual progress. It's a time for deepening meditation, mindfulness. They even have special ceremonies and festivals that coincide with full moons, supermoons included, of course.
So it seems like even though the scientific explanation is pretty straightforward, the cultural and spiritual interpretations are incredibly varied and rich with meaning.
Yes, it speaks to something universal, I think, this human need to find meaning, to connect with something bigger than ourselves. And what's bigger than the cosmos, right?
Right. And that brings us to another interesting topic, empaths and how they supposedly experience supermoons. One of our sources, an article from Sleepyverse, it claims that empaths feel extra sensitive during supermoons. Disrupted sleep, heightened emotions, a surge of spiritual energy. What do you make of these claims?
Well, it's definitely intriguing. But as we've been saying, it's important to balance curiosity with a healthy dose of skepticism. Where do you think that balance lies here?
Well, we know sleep disruption can be a real thing with full moons, and by extension, supermoons. And if someone's already sensitive to energy shifts, maybe that amplified energy during a supermoon could affect them more intensely.
But we also have to remember the power of belief. The placebo effect is real. If an empath believes a supermoon will make them feel certain things, those beliefs can actually create those feelings.
So it's a mix of physiology, psychology, maybe some energetic factors too.
Exactly. It's complex. We shouldn't dismiss personal experiences outright. But we should be aware of these potential biases when we interpret those experiences.
So for our listener who might be thinking, okay, how should I approach a supermoon? What's your advice?
I'd say approach it with curiosity and self-awareness. Pay attention to how you're feeling, your energy levels, emotions, any changes in how you perceive things. Keep a journal if that helps you track things, but try to do it without any preconceived ideas. Let your experience be your guide.
I like that. It's like your own little personal science experiment, guided by curiosity and an open mind.
Exactly. And you never know. Those observations, they might spark new questions, new discoveries, and that could add to our understanding of this whole supermoon phenomenon.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. Not just chasing some big dramatic experience, but just being present and noticing what's going on.
Right. And speaking of noticing, let's go back to that definition of a supermoon for a second. It really all comes down to that elliptical orbit, bringing the moon closer to us.
Right, that perigee full moon alignment. That's the key.
And we've talked about how it looks, the myths, the potential subtle effects, but there's one more question I think is worth thinking about. As our listeners gazing up at that next supermoon.
Okay, I'm listening. Hit me with it.
We know the moon's gravity affects the tides, but gravity, it affects everything, right? Our bodies. They're mostly water, too. So could those stronger gravitational forces during a supermoon, could they have any effect on us physically?
That's an interesting thought. Are you saying there might be things going on that we don't even fully understand yet, beyond what traditional science can explain?
It's definitely possible. We're always learning new things about the universe, the subtle energies at play and how they interact with our bodies. Maybe supermoons, they give us a chance to explore those questions even more.
So what should our listener do? Start tracking their heart rate every time there's a supermoon.
Maybe not heart rate specifically, but paying attention to any little changes, energy levels, moods, sleep patterns, anything that seems different around the time of a supermoon. Keeping a journal could be helpful. You might start to see some interesting patterns over time.
I like it. It's like a personal science experiment,
Mm-hmm.
driven by your own curiosity.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe those observations will lead to new questions, new discoveries that help us understand this whole lunar phenomenon even better.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. We've looked at the science behind supermoons, busted some myths, explored the cultural side of things, and those possible subtle influences.
And we did it all while keeping that sense of wonder alive, that spirit of exploration.
To our listener, the next time you see a supermoon shining bright, remember what we've talked about. Take in its beauty. Think about its impact. Maybe even do some of your own observing.
And you never know, you might just unlock a little piece of that lunar mystery for yourself.
That's a perfect way to wrap things up. Until next time, everyone, keep looking up and happy moon gazing.